Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the most insightful research and powerful frameworks and, well, we boil them down into essential knowledge you can use right now. Today, we are tackling a belief that is so foundational to business culture that questioning it feels, almost heretical. We are challenging the core idea that a leader's primary responsibility is to motivate their people.
It's the ultimate motivation paradox, isn't it? I mean, for decades, we have relied on this toolbox of external levers, bonuses, leaderboards, public praise, the occasional threat. And yet, global engagement surveys just keep showing this massive number of people who are just going through the motions. So today, we are diving deep into the analysis laid out by Susan Fowler in her work, Why Motivating People Doesn't Work and What Does.
That title alone just stops you in your tracks. Okay, so let's unpack this immediately because the central thesis, it reframes the entire discussion. If you're leading a team, you are not a motivational speaker. You're not a mechanic trying to fix a broken engine by just pulling the right lever.
Exactly. The book forces us to accept a scientific truth, which is that motivation is not something that you, as a leader, do to people. It is inherently something people create and generate and sustain within themselves. And if we accept that premise, then the leader's job fundamentally shifts from being a controller who, dispenses rewards to being a facilitator who cultivates the environment.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Our mission today is to give you the shortcut to understanding this new framework. We'll start by really dismantling the myth, exploring why those traditional external methods just inevitably fail. Then we will establish the scientific foundation, which is self-determination theory, or SDT, and walk through the revolutionary motivation spectrum. And finally, we'll pinpoint the three core psychological needs, the foundational pillars that leaders have to support to unlock that sustainable, high-quality motivation in their teams.
And we will move beyond the abstract to the tangible. We'll explore practical tools like the Motivation Outlook Conversation, or MOC, which gives a really structured way for leaders to guide their people toward a higher quality internal drive.
Let's jump right in then, because if those common external levers, if they feel so good in the short term, producing that quick burst of compliance, why do they fail us so spectacularly in the long run? The default setting in most organizations is what we call the short-term trap. The pressure's on for quarterly results, right? So the leader reaches for the quickest tool, external motivators, a massive sales bonus, a tightly enforced performance plan, a public competition with a prize for the winner. These strategies work, don't they? I mean, you see people working harder right now, but that short-term burst, it masks a really destructive psychological cost.
That is the crucial distinction. Compliance versus commitment. The carrot and the stick, they breed compliance, an obligation to act. They drive people to work just hard enough to secure the reward or, avoid the punishment. But commitment, that genuine, sustained energy where people invest their creativity and discretionary effort, that is actively undermined by these methods.
Yeah, and the source material is very clear on the documented fallout of relying on these controlled techniques. It's not just anecdotal, is it? The long-term impact includes a significant reduction in creativity, high anxiety, burnout, and a deep erosion of trust. So let's dive into the mechanism of failure, starting with the most popular tool. Financial incentives. I mean, the idea that incentives undermine intrinsic motivation is deeply counterintuitive. We all think money makes the job more appealing.
What's fascinating here is that the incentive shifts the focus from the task itself to the reward. Psychologically, we invoke what's known in self-determination theory as, it's called cognitive evaluation theory, or CET. And CET explains that every reward has two functions, a controlling function and an informational function.
Okay, walk us through that duality. What does that mean?
So when a reward is perceived primarily as a controller, a way to do what the boss wants, it shifts the individual psychological perspective, their locus of causality. It moves from internal to external. Let's say you genuinely enjoy solving complex analytical problems. That's your intrinsic motivation. Now, if I suddenly start paying you a massive explicit bonus, only if you solve those problems exactly my way and within my rigid timeline, your brain reassigns the reason for the action. You stop thinking, I do this because I value the challenge, and you start thinking, I do this for the money and for the boss's approval. The reward is now managing you.
So you've essentially turned a fulfilling activity into a transaction. And once that specific reward is gone, or maybe if the bonus isn't big enough next quarter, that initial internal drive, that often doesn't just come back.
It's often lost completely. You have unintentionally destroyed the intrinsic drive that was there before you introduced the extrinsic reward. You created dependency. And this is why great leaders need to be more like gardeners, creating fertile conditions rather than mechanics just pulling levers. The minute you use an external lever to control behavior, you risk eroding the internal desire to perform that behavior autonomously.
And this destructive cycle, it extends beyond financial incentives to performance pressure. We often mistake pressure for motivation. We believe high stakes drive better performance. But the sources reveal that pressure actually impairs the kind of complex thinking we need most today.
It does. Pressure increases anxiety, and anxiety narrows your cognitive focus. You get what we call tunnel vision. Now, for simple, repetitive tasks, pressure might temporarily boost output, sure. But for complex work requiring creativity, problem-solving, or collaboration, high pressure leads to mistakes, rigidity, and ultimately, burnout. People rush, they avoid risk, and they focus on just surviving the immediate deadline rather than generating high-quality, sustainable solutions. They produce these unstable, temporary results that just evaporate once the pressure subsides.
I want to focus now on something that's a beloved workplace currency: praise. Leaders are constantly told, praise frequently, use recognition as a motivator. But the book suggests that a reliance on praise is actually another failure mechanism. Now hold on, are we saying leaders should never recognize good work? Where is the line between controlling praise and supportive informational feedback that reinforces competence?
That is a critical question. And it really speaks to the nuance required in this whole approach. The problem isn't recognition itself. The problem is controlling praise. Controlling praise focuses on the leader's standards and approval. You did that exactly the way I taught you, or I am proud of you for exceeding the numbers. This type of praise connects success back to the leader's ego and external validation.
It makes the employee dependent on the applause.
Precisely. If my drive comes from needing your approval, I am dependent on the external environment to validate my actions. I'm working to earn your reaction, not because the work itself is intrinsically meaningful.
So what does non-controlling, helpful feedback sound like?
That's the informational function of feedback. Informational feedback focuses on the competence and the impact of the action, not the leader's satisfaction. So instead of, great job, I approve, the leader might say, that analysis of the Q3 data was especially insightful. The way you integrated the market trends demonstrated real mastery of the forecasting model. See? This feedback focuses on the individual's skill and the objective success of the output. It reinforces competence, which is one of the 3 psychological needs we'll discuss, and it encourages the person to repeat the successful behavior because they feel capable, not because they earned some external approval.
That distinction is subtle, but wow, it's profound. It shifts the focus from pleasing the boss to mastering the craft. And if incentives are the carrot and pressure is the whip, then micromanagement is the executioner of motivation, because it just removes the opportunity for mastery altogether.
The research is absolutely unambiguous on micromanagement. It directly kills the potential for internal motivation because it removes ownership, the core of autonomy. When a leader provides overly detailed, rigid instructions on how every small task should be completed, they send 2 devastating psychological messages. First, I do not trust your competence. And second, you have no choice or personal imprint on this work. The employee just becomes a robot executing commands. The leader, in trying to ensure quality control, destroys the very mechanism that generates genuine commitment, forcing the employee immediately into a controlled or disengaged state of motivation.
So the damage report is clear. People may look busy, they may appear motivated because they're complying out of fear or obligation or the pursuit of some temporary prize, but beneath the surface, creativity stagnates, anxiety soars, and trust just dissolves. The key lesson here is that great leaders must stop thinking of themselves as motivators and start thinking of themselves as architects of psychological well-being.
That's the core shift. You cannot motivate people, but you can profoundly influence the quality of the motivation they generate. The traditional methods, the short-term traps, they target the quantity.
Yeah.
Are they working? Well, the human-centered approach targets the quality. Why are they working? And that quality, that internal why, that's the only path to sustainable performance and, well, genuine human flourishing.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting as we move from the philosophical critique to the scientific framework that underpins Fowler's approach, self-determination theory. SDT argues that the quality of motivation matters infinitely more than the raw quantity of effort. It's not just a binary switch on or off, but a rich, detailed continuum. Walk us through this spectrum.
This spectrum, it shifts our entire perspective. We stop asking, how much motivation does this person have? And we start asking, what type of motivation is driving them? The spectrum is a sliding scale, moving from the lowest energy point to the highest quality, most sustainable drive. And it's so important to know where you or your team members currently sit on it.
And we begin at the lowest ebb, A motivation.
Correct. A motivation is the starting point. It's characterized by a complete absence of energy or intention or enthusiasm. The person just doesn't see the point. They often feel incapable of influencing the outcome. It's learned helplessness. They're not actively resisting work, they are simply detached. And this is often an alarming signal of a chronic failure to meet their psychological needs.
Moving slightly up, we find the first level of action, even if it's reluctant action.
That brings us to disengaged motivation. This is pure external regulation, so action driven solely by explicit external coercion. This is the classic stick motivation. The person acts only to avoid a negative consequence. They meet the deadline solely because they fear being fired, or they show up to the required meeting only because the HR policy demands it. They're acting, but they're doing the absolute minimum required to escape punishment. We often call this the clock puncher or check the box mentality. The action is tenuous and it stops immediately once the threat is removed.
All right, now we hit the vast middle ground where most organizations mistakenly believe they are achieving success. Controlled motivation. This is where the rewards, the ego, and the need for approval kick in.
Controlled motivation is deceptive. It is action driven by external rewards, like a bonus, or these powerful internal pressures, such as shame or guilt, or the desire to prove oneself, what we call ego motivation. This state often produces high short-term results, which is why managers rely on it so much. However, it is fundamentally unstable and externally managed. If the boss changes, the bonus disappears, or the competition ends, the drive just collapses.
And there are subtle but important psychological nuances within controlled motivation, aren't there? It's not just one single block.
Absolutely. We have two subcategories here. The first is introjected regulation. This is motivation driven by internal pressures like ego, guilt, or shame. I must hit this target or I will feel like a failure or people will look down on me. Yeah. The pressure is internalized, but it is still rooted in external validation. The action feels like a should or a must.
And the second type?
That is identified regulation. This is slightly better. Here, the individual has consciously identified with the value of the goal, but they haven't fully integrated it into their self-concept. They see the work as useful, like, I need to file these reports because they are necessary for the team's success, but they still don't inherently enjoy the task itself. It feels useful, but still effortful and managed. This is sort of the bridge away from pure control.
And the book really stresses that controlled motivation, while often effective in the short term, is emotionally costly.
Oh, the emotional cost is astronomical. Because your sense of accomplishment is constantly managed by external forces, the incentive, the boss's opinion, you are locked in a perpetual state of chasing. Interjected regulation, driven by ego and shame, leads directly to anxiety, chronic stress, and ultimately burnout. You never achieve true satisfaction because the finish line is always defined by someone else or by an unstable internal sense of worthiness.
So let's move past that costly, unstable state. What does the highest quality, sustainable motivation look like?
That is autonomous motivation. This is the gold standard. It's driven by intrinsic factors: genuine interest, deep personal purpose, and strong alignment with personal values. When motivation is autonomous, people don't need a manager standing over them or a prize dangled in front of them. They generate their own energy because the work itself is either fulfilling, which we call intrinsic regulation, or because they deeply believe the value and purpose the work creates and have fully integrated it into who they are. That's integrated regulation.
This emphasizes the crucial role of the why, connecting the often mundane task to a bigger picture that truly resonates with the individual.
Yes. And we must emphasize that autonomous motivation doesn't mean every single task is enjoyable. That's a really common misconception. The power stems from linking the work, even the boring parts, to purpose and core personal values. Think of a financial analyst who finds compiling complex compliance spreadsheets, well, tedious. If they operate from autonomous motivation, they're doing that tedious work not because they love regulation, but because they deeply value accuracy, integrity, and protecting the organization's reputation. They have internalized the value of the boring task. When work is aligned with these deep personal drivers, internal energy is naturally generated and sustained, even through the grind.
And for you, the listener, why does understanding the spectrum matter to your personal performance and your career trajectory?
It is the first step towards self-awareness and self-management. If you realize your primary drive for a current project is controlled motivation, for instance, you're performing brilliantly, but only because you're terrified of disappointing your mentor, that's interjected regulation, you gain the power to shift it. You can pause, you can reflect, and you can consciously work to find the intrinsic value or purpose in that task, shifting your internal monologue from "I have to do this" to "I choose to do this because it aligns with my value of professionalism." That shift is the pathway to higher quality, more sustainable performance, and crucially, greater well-being.
So we know autonomous motivation is the gold standard, but the question remains, how do we actually cultivate it? The research shows that people naturally generate autonomous motivation when 3 core psychological needs, which are considered universal and innate, are consistently met. Let's dive deep into the foundations of sustainable motivation autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
These 3 needs, ACR, are the psychological nutrients every human requires. They're akin to the physical needs for air, food, and shelter. When a leader supports these 3 needs, they are creating that fertile ground we talked about earlier, allowing individuals to generate high-quality, sustainable motivation. And if even one of these 3 is chronically neglected, performance and well-being suffer dramatically.
Let's start with the one most frequently undermined in hierarchical structures: autonomy. In a corporate setting, leaders often panic when they hear this word. They equate it with a complete lack of accountability, just chaos. What is the precise definition of autonomy in this context?
Right. It's not about absolute freedom. It is the psychological feeling of choice and ownership over one's actions. It's the belief that you are the source of your actions. When an individual feels autonomous, they experience an internal locus of causality. They are doing the work because they choose to, not because they're forced to.
So a leader's job isn't to let everyone choose the company's direction, but to offer meaningful choices within defined boundaries.
Precisely. It means allowing choices in methods, in pacing, or in task organization, even if the final outcome is non-negotiable. A truly supportive leader says, the deadline is fixed on Friday, but you have the choice of how you structure your week to achieve it and which tools you use. This contrasts so sharply with micromanagement, which strips away that locus of control, sending the message, you must do exactly what I tell you, exactly how I tell you. When choice is granted and respected, the individual feels ownership over both the process and the result, and that fuels their internal drive.
Okay, moving on to competence. This seems self-evident, feeling capable, but how does a leader actively support this need beyond just providing, basic training?
Competence is the feeling of being effective, masterful, and skillful in interacting with one's environment. It's not just about possessing skills, it's about the ongoing experience of growth and success. A critical aspect of supporting competence is providing the optimal challenge.
This connects to the concept of the flow state, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow dovetails perfectly with SDT here. Flow occurs when a person is deeply absorbed in an activity because the challenges are perfectly matched to their current skills. If the work is too easy, people quickly become bored and they feel their skills atrophy. A profound undermining of competence. If the work is too difficult, they become overwhelmed, anxious, and frustrated, leading to a sense of helplessness, which pushes them right toward motivation.
So the leader's job is to continually assess that gap between the employee's current skills and the required challenge, making sure that growth is always slightly out of reach, but achievable.
Yes, and that requires constant, high-quality informational feedback. When an employee fails, the leader should frame the mistake not as a character flaw or some controlling failure like, you failed the objective and cost us money. Instead, it should be framed as valuable developmental information. This outcome didn't meet the standard, so let's analyze the process so you can master the next phase. Supporting competence requires celebrating mastery and ensuring individuals feel they are growing, learning, and successfully navigating appropriate levels of challenge.
And finally, relatedness. In a modern, often distributed work environment where we communicate so transactionally through screens and emails, how do we foster this profound sense of connection and belonging?
Relatedness is the need to feel connected, respected, and genuinely cared for within the group or organization. This is perhaps the most essential humanizing need, and it moves far beyond just being friendly or having mandatory social events. It's about creating an environment of psychological safety where individuals feel respected as human beings, not just cogs in a machine.
So it's not just about liking your colleagues.
No, it's about mutual trust and shared purpose. When employees believe their leaders and colleagues genuinely respect their value, even if they disagree with their methods, they are far more willing to contribute their full discretionary effort. They contribute not just for personal gain, but for the success of the group they feel emotionally invested in. Conversely, if a leader treats employees as fungible resources, only seeing them in terms of their output, the need for relatedness is shattered, leading quickly to cynicism and disengaged motivation. The holistic connection is key. When a leader supports ACR, they are cultivating the optimal psychological environment necessary for high-quality, autonomous motivation to flourish, which in turn predicts both well-being and improved organizational results.
This entire framework requires a fundamental gut-level shift for anyone who is trained in traditional management philosophy. You have to transition from being a controller, the chief source of all rewards and punishments, to a facilitator, the chief architect of the psychological conditions. What does this profound redefining of the leadership role actually look like in the day-to-day?
The primary task shifts entirely to the sustained, active support of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. This means spending time not managing output metrics, but managing the psychological energy of the team. The leader has to become adept at diagnosis. So, is an employee struggling with performance? A controller asks, how can I penalize or incentivize this person? A facilitator asks, which of the three needs is being neglected here? Are they struggling with competence because the challenge is too high, or maybe lacking autonomy because of bureaucratic processes?
And one of the most powerful and practical aspects of Fowler's work is the emphasis on aligning work with personal values, especially when the day-to-day tasks are inherently boring or difficult. How does a leader facilitate that connection without just sounding like a corporate life coach?
It involves guiding the employee through reflective practice, making the why visible. This is where the leader serves as a kind of values translator. So instead of simply saying, complete this quarterly audit, the leader has to dedicate conversation time to help the individual connect that compliance task to something they genuinely value.
Can you give us an example of how that conversation might be framed?
Certainly. If you have an employee who values integrity and accuracy, the conversation moves from the task to the value. We know the audit process is tedious, but how does the sheer quality of your attention to detail in this audit process tie into your personal value of professionalism and ethical accuracy? Quote, by guaranteeing the integrity of this data, what fundamental principle are you supporting for the wider organization? By fostering ownership and encouraging this reflection, the leader helps the employee internalize the why, moving their current motivation from controlled doing it to avoid the shame of a bad audit toward autonomous doing it because it matters to their internal sense of worth and standards.
That brings us to the most practical framework introduced in the book, the Motivation Outlook Conversation, or MOC. This is a structured tool designed to implement this reflective practice. So tell us how an MOC works, because it's not just a friendly check-in.
No. It's a formal, guided intervention designed to help individuals consciously identify the type of motivation they currently hold for a specific task or goal, and crucially, understand the emotional cost of that motivation. The leader acts as a mirror and a guide, but never a dictator.
So the leader guides the conversation, but the employee does the heavy lifting of self-diagnosis.
Exactly. The MOC typically follows 3 key conversational steps, starting with a non-judgmental exploration of the current behavior. The leader might ask something like, tell me about your approach to the new budget proposal. What kind of energy are you bringing to it right now?
Okay. And what comes next?
The second step focuses on the rationale. The leader gently probes the source of the energy, using non-leading questions that help the employees self-diagnose their spot on the spectrum. Questions might include, what is the primary reason you are putting in this effort? Is it because you find the financial modeling interesting, or is it simply because the deadline is looming and you need to avoid the consequences? This helps the employee articulate if they are acting from a motivation, disengaged, controlled, or autonomous energy.
And the third step focuses on that concept of emotional cost.
Yes. The core function is helping the individual recognize the toll their current motivation is taking. If the employee identifies that they are operating purely from controlled motivation, say, driven by the fear of looking incompetent, the leader guides them to recognize the toll that fear is taking. The leader might ask, if you continue to operate from a place of pure anxiety and external pressure, what does that cost you personally over the next 6 months in terms of your creativity, your well-being, and your relationships?
The power of this is that the leader isn't saying, you need to be autonomously motivated now. They are guiding the employee to the realization that their current mode of operation is unsustainable or emotionally costly, which then creates the internal impetus, the choice, to shift toward a healthier, higher quality approach.
That realization empowers the individual. They choose a better path, consciously seeking ways to inject autonomy, competence, or relatedness into their current role, thus transforming the quality of their engagement from within. They're taking back control of their own drive.
This sounds ideal, but the analysis acknowledges implementation challenges. I mean, this requires a cultural revolution, not just a procedural update.
Absolutely. The analysis specifically notes that the main hurdle is managerial inertia. Leaders who are comfortable being controllers often find it deeply uncomfortable to release that control and transition into a facilitator role. Furthermore, organizations are fundamentally built on external rewards and accountability metrics that often function as explicit controls. This approach requires cultural patience to fully implement. You can't expect decades of incentive-driven behavior to change overnight just because a manager had one MOC. It's a long-term strategy prioritizing sustainable well-being over quick, unstable fixes, which goes against the grain of the short-term business mindset. It requires leaders to be vulnerable, reflective, and willing to invest in the long-term psychological health of their teams.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We've moved from the destructive nature of traditional incentives and the psychological mechanisms like the controlling function of rewards, all the way to the 3 pillars of psychological health and the practical tool of the motivation outlook conversation. The power of self-determination theory and the resulting move toward human-centered leadership over mechanical management is clear, and it's why this work has resonated so strongly with leadership coaches and HR professionals globally.
The essential idea is this. We must stop trying to manipulate motivation and start understanding how to nourish it. And this is not just a soft skill or a feel-good policy. It is the most robust performance driver available. When people feel autonomous, competent, and connected, they deliver their best work because they want to.
Let's consolidate the final sticky takeaways for you, our listener, the core lessons that should stick long after this deep dive is over.
First and foremost, remember the difference between transactional pressure and genuine commitment. Pressure produces compliance, but it does not produce commitment. And compliance is always unstable and costly.
Second, sustainable, high-quality performance is driven entirely by supporting those 3 psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness, or ACR. If you only focus on one, the entire structure falters.
And finally, true leadership is about empowerment, not control. Your role is to shift your focus from managing external results to cultivating the internal environment where intrinsic drive can naturally flourish.
That is a profound shift in thinking for anyone in a leadership position, or really anyone striving for higher quality motivation in their own lives. As we wrap up this deep dive into the structure of internal drive, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, specifically relating to the systems you operate within.
Since the book targets sustainable, long-term well-being and performance, consider this. If internal motivation is driven by autonomy, competence, and relatedness, what is one single metric your organization or team currently uses related to performance reviews, accountability, or project tracking that is actively undermining one of those 3 needs? For example, does a hyper-rigid time tracking system kill autonomy? Does a forced ranking system undermine relatedness? Identify that metric, analyze its true psychological cost, and then consider, what concrete, small adjustment could you make to shift that metric from being a tool of control to a tool of empowerment?
That small shift could be your own starting point for cultivating autonomous motivation in your team. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.